Static visualizations, like the ones we've been making so far, can be pretty cool. However, I think that any visualization will be exponentially improved if we can interact with it. So we're going to look at interacting with our visualization via events in this screencast. Now we're going to begin exactly where we left off in the previous screencast with the very same code. And of course, this means our visualization, as you can see here, is exactly the same as what we had in the previous screencast. What can we do to add some events to this? Well, let's say this. Right now, we don't really know. Right now, we can kind of guess what the data values for each one of these different points is, because we have the axes to help us kind of figure that out. However, let's make it so that when we hover over these, their x and y coordinates will appear so we can see exactly what values they are. Now you might think that because we're working with SVG here, events might work a little bit differently for some weird reason. The truth is they don't. SVG elements are really just like HTML elements when it comes to events, just as they're like HTML elements in everything else. We can use regular JavaScript event listeners to listen to events that occur on these elements, and then we can perform actions on them. So let's look at an example of this. Down here at the bottom, we have our visualization being made right here at the bottom. We want to add another method here, and this is the on method, which is the method that D3 uses to apply events to our circles or whatever elements we have currently selected. So for example, let's say we want to do a mouse over event. That is the equivalent of the beginning of a hover. We'll pass this a function. Just like our attribute and text functions, this takes the data object and the position number as two parameters there. And let's go ahead and do something really simple for now. We can say d3.select this. Now, what is the value of this? Well, inside these event functions, this is the value of whatever element was moused over. So we're applying this mouse over to event to all the circles that we have. This will refer to whichever circle was rolled over. However, was moused over. However, it won't be a D3 object, it'll just be the raw DOM node. And so we want to turn that into a D3 selection by saying d3.select this. And then we can say .attribute. And let's begin with something really simple. We'll change the fill to orange. So now if I refresh this page, you can see that as I hover over each circle, it turns orange. You'll notice though that these circles stay orange after we mouse off. We do need to handle a mouse off event for that to work. Let me say right here that this would be a poor use of a JavaScript event. And the reason is because we can do this with CSS. Because remember, we can treat SVG elements just like we treat every other HTML element. We can actually set the fill this way. So let me go ahead and set this to green, and let me come back here, and I'm actually going to comment this whole thing out. And now if I refresh the page here, you can see that as I hover over each of these, oh, that green's a bit dark. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see that light green. Okay, there. As I'm hovering over each element, you can see that its fill color has changed to green. Now, obviously, we can't change every property on an SVG element from the CSS. For example, we unfortunately cannot change the radius, for example. So we'll have to change the radius from the JavaScript. And we actually do want to change the radius from the JavaScript in this screencast. However, I'm going to just comment this out as a reminder to you that you can use CSS and CSS3, of course, CSS3 transitions. Those work just fine as well. Anything like that, it can be done from the CSS. However, not everything can be done from the CSS. So let's come back here. Let's also change the radius to radius times 2. All right, so now when I hover over each one of these, oh, the radius is not getting set. Then that's because the radius parameter is not called radius, it's just called r. There, now you can see every time I roll over one, it doubles in size and becomes orange. Okay, so that's our first part. Double in size and become orange. But we also want to display some text, don't we? So now we want to add a text element which tells us exactly what the coordinates of that point is. So we're going to do svg.append, a text element here, and then let's set a few attributes here. We can set the x to be, and we want this to be a function we want to call xscale d.x. So we got the very same xscale value as we did for the x value of our circle's coordinates, but then we want to subtract 30 just so we move it back to the left a little bit. Notice that we did not take d as a parameter to this function, and that's because this text element here is not bound to any specific data. We don't have to bind this to the data because it's just something that's temporarily going to show up. Instead, we get this data passed in here to the mouse over function, and we can use that inside of this function here via closure. So d.x in here will refer to this d element up there. Now, we want to do something really similar for y, so I'm just going to copy that, and we'll change d.y, and we want to use the y scale, and this is setting the y property. And so now let's call text here. Once again, it will not take d because we are not binding any data to this text element. However, we can get the d from above. And I'm going to use the same string concatenation shortcut I showed you earlier, where we just pass it an array and it'll give us a string with a comma between them. So that should be all we need for now to get things up and running. If I refresh the page, there you can see as soon as I hover over it, the text is appearing close by the values. And you know what? That's a little bit high and not quite far enough over to the left. Let's change that to -10. How does that look? That's better. However, let's just bump it up to maybe -15. There, that's better. Okay, so now every time we hover over one of these points, we can see exactly what its values are. However, those values are staying there after we hover off. So how do we get the values to disappear after we do that? And of course, we want the circle to go back down to its normal radius and color. Well, for this, we need to add another function here, and this is going to be .on. We need to add a mouse out event. Once again, we'll take the data. I don't think we'll need the I. And so we can start with the circle and say d3.select this, and we want to set the attributes. We want to set the fill to black as it was before, and we set the radius equal to the radius variable that we have. So let's see, for starters, that works fine. Circles go back to normal after we hover off. However, the text element is still in place. It's obvious we need to call the .remove method, but the question here is, how do we select the right text element? Now you might think, well, if I hover over and then I hover away, I can select all the text elements available, right? Because there's only that one available. That's actually not true because these text elements in our axes will be included as well. Now, if we'd done some smarter grouping, things could be a little bit different. We could just find the text element within the group if we were just to add both the circle and its text element into the same group and then have the hover event on the group, maybe. However, here's the way I like to do it. Back up here where we create the text element, let's add an ID to it. So we'll give it an ID of t, and then we will just add dx plus hyphen plus d.y, and that actually has to be d.x, plus another dash, and then we'll add I being this number up here. So just in case we have multiple data values with the exact same x and y points, they'll differ by I at least. And although this may not be applicable in this particular example, that's something you may want to consider. For example, if you have a bar chart where you have two bars that have the same value, you want to make sure you're selecting the right one. Now that we have that ID up there, we can come down here. We can select the element that has an ID of t, d.x dash, d.y dash I. Can't forget to add I to our mouse out function there. All right, let's see if that works. We come back and refresh this page. Looks like we have an error. Oh yeah, and I just forgot a plus sign before the I at the end. There we go. Let me refresh this again. And now we hover over, and as we hover away, it disappears. Excellent. Okay, so there is a mouse over and a mouse out event. As you can see, this is exactly like adding JavaScript events to pretty much any JavaScript app that you've ever used. It's very, very straightforward. Let's take this one step further. Let's say that we want to add a new element wherever we click on this chart. So this means we need to have, right down at the bottom here, on our SVG, we want to say on click. First thing we need to do is find where the mouse was clicked. Thankfully, this is really easy in D3. So we're going to create our coordinates, and we have the d3.mouse function. And we pass to this mouse function an element, and we will get back the offset from the beginning of that element. Now, thankfully, this refers to the SVG element that we were clicked on here. And the SVG element is exactly what we want to find the offset from the top left corner of that SVG element. So we just have to say coords equals d3.mouse and pass it this. Then we need to create our new data, and this is just going to be a simple object with an x and a y. The x is going to be xScale.invert coords 0. Now, coords is going to be an array of two items. The 0 will be the x, and the 1 will be the y. I'm passing this to xScale.invert because every scale has the invert method, which allows us to basically put something backwards through. It allows us to give it a number in the range and get a value from the domain. And the reason we have to do this is because if you look at our chart here, when I click, for example, right here, this has to have a data value of about x40. However, the actual position of the pixels is going to be a much, much higher number. 40 is going to be more over here. So what we have is the pixel number, and we need to find the data number. And obviously this is a perfect job for invert because normally we have the data number and we need to find the pixel number. And I'm using math.round because I want our data to be nice whole numbers, but of course our scale, since it's continuous, will probably not put out a whole number if we don't click in the right spot. So then we want to do the exact same thing for coords index 1, except this time we use the Y scale. And so now we have our new data, and we want to say data.push our new data. So we've just pushed this into the array of data that we have up here at the beginning. And now that we've pushed that into that array, we can update our visualization. Now this is where that update pattern will start to make a little bit more sense to you. We can do an svg.select all the circles, and now we bind our new data to it. Now we're one circle short, remember? All of our previous circles are where they should be visualizing their data, and they're all going to get bound to the same data elements because they're in the same order. However, we need a new circle, and that is about to enter the stage, and so we append our new circle. And now we need to set the attributes for that new circle. Now the attributes for this new circle are going to be the very same attributes that we set right here on our circles originally. So what we could do, and why don't we do this? I'll just move it up here, just below the scales, because we do need the scales. I can say var circle adders, and we create an object there, and paste these lines right in here. So now we create an object, and we can do this because these are functions and they'll be called when the circles are made, right? And radius is just a static value. So circle adders can replace this object right in here. Now we can just say circle adders. And now this line right here, boom, we just have to paste it there. And so now our new circle will have the same attributes as the old ones. And so this looks good. I just have to change svg.select to select all. Sorry about that. All right, so now if we come back here and refresh the page, we have all of these hovers working fine. And now if I click somewhere like right here, you can see, boom, we have a new circle appended right there. And I can just be clicking all over the place and we get new data values. However, you might notice something about these data values. If I hover over them, I don't get those events. I do from the old ones, but the new ones, I don't get anything when I hover over them. And this should make sense to you. When we called on here and here, this was on the new circles that we created here. And we never gave those event handlers to these other circles. So we have to do that. So let's begin by pulling these functions out of here, paste it right at the bottom, and I'll change this to handle mouse over. And then up here, we just have to set that to handle mouse over. Then I'll pull this function out. I'll call that handle mouse out. And so now we can just call handle mouse out right here. And now I can just copy these two lines and right down here. And right down here, after we give those circles their new attributes, we can go ahead and assign these mouse handlers to handle them as well. And now when we refresh this, you can see these circles have event handlers working. We click, and now these circles have event handlers working as well. Now, of course, if I refresh the page, our new circles disappear because we're not persisting them to the server in any way at all. However, you get the idea of events working here on our SVG elements. So that's a basic look at events in D3. As you can see, they're really no different at all from regular old JavaScript events. In fact, I am using the D3 method on in this screencast, but you could do this with a plain old event handler in JavaScript, just doing a element.addEventListener. I do want to remind you just one more time that these SVG elements can be modified with CSS as well. So you can use the hover pseudo class and get effects from that as well, which will be smart if you have a lot of heavy JavaScript work. Pass some of that styling stuff off to the CSS if you can, and it may be better performance for your end user.